Welcome to Dweller of the Dark. We are a channel honoring the yellowed and blackened bones of many prominent authors. We will be digging up several obscure, strange, and forgotten authors who influenced many of the great horror, science fiction, and fantasy writers today. More tales of the horrifying, obscure, strange, and forgotten are climbing out of the tombs. Check out our links below for more information. Subscribe, comment, like, donate, or I'll send the devil of Black Bayou to rip your head off, as we did the like button. Send us ghoulish delights for the Skull and Bones collection. Your pound of writer's flesh will feed our ghouls for now. Children of horror, legion of ghouls. Tonight, we present the horror master who terrified Stephen King. This is Joseph Payne Brennan's terrifying hospital horror. Who was he? First written in 1969 for Macabre House, this heartbreaker may leave a ghastly chill. Enjoy. Who was he? By Joseph Payne Brennan. Several months ago, while I was in the hospital recovering from a coronary attack, I underwent a bizarre and frightening experience, which I am at a loss to explain. But I want to get the facts down before they begin to fade, as most events seem to do. After I was released from the intensive care unit, I was put in a small, single room near the end of what I referred to as coronary corridor. This corridor was long, rather narrow, and not particularly well lighted. There were about a dozen of the single rooms situated along both sides of it. After a day or two, I usually kept my door shut in order to muffle the racket of radios and television sets which came from the other rooms. I preferred to read quietly. One day, as I was reading, the door softly opened. I didn't hear it open, but I was perfectly aware, even before I looked up, that someone was standing in the doorway. I had hoped it might be a visitor, but I saw, with disappointment and a twinge of annoyance, that it was only a hospital barber. He wore a thin alpaca cloth jacket which looked a bit seedy, and he carried a small, rather disreputable black bag. Instead of speaking, he merely formed a wordless question by lifting his thick black eyebrows. I shook my head. Not right now. Perhaps later on. He looked inordinately disappointed, and he lingered in the doorway a moment. Finally, he turned, closing the door quietly. For some reason, I could no longer concentrate on my book. I admitted to myself at length that he had startled me, and that this had made me angry. Not a proper state of affairs, I realized, for a coronary patient. I took a tranquilizer and tried to sleep, unsuccessfully. I slept reasonably well that night, however, with the aid of a sleeping tablet and after various ablutions, bed changings, temperature takings, etc., the next morning I settled back to my book. But I found that I was still unable to concentrate on it, although it had held my attention well enough the day before. At length, as I glanced around the small room, frowning with fretfulness, I realized what the trouble was. My door was again closed as I had requested, but now I found that I no longer wanted it closed. For the life of me, I couldn't say why. Since I was still forbidden to walk, I rang for the nurse. A nurse's aide, a rather breezy, flaxen-haired Swedish girl, swept in. "Tired of being a hermit already? I thought you'd change your mind." I smiled, rather sheepishly, I suppose, and she went out, leaving the door open. I returned to my book, but some buried part of my mind kept mulling over the business about the door. I finally had to admit the truth. I definitely did not want that shabby-looking hospital barber to open the door while I was reading and startle me again. The raucous screech and blare of television and radio continued to irritate me, but I tried to read over it. In this, I was only partially successful. After lunch, I began to feel drowsy. I laid aside my book and was starting to doze off when a terrific, hair-raising scream lifted me upright in bed. I was sure that it had originated in one of the other nearby rooms along the corridor. I could feel my heart pounding. I tried to tell myself that the scream had come from a television set. Someone, I assured myself, had suddenly and inadvertently turned a volume dial up to its maximum potential. Moments later, I heard a great commotion in the corridor. Nurses and orderlies rushed by. I had no idea there were so many people on the floor. Doctors hurried past. There was a brief period of murmured commands, conversation, and then near silence. Slowly, the nurses and orderlies walked back down the corridor. A few minutes later, a still form, covered from head to foot with a rubberized sheet, was rolled past my door. I waited a while and then rang for a nurse. The flaxen-haired Swedish nurse's aide hurried in. I had never known her to respond so swiftly before. I thought she looked a little pale. "What happened?" I asked her. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Mr. Caldress, across the corridor, one room down." "Fatal attack?" She nodded. I watched her face. "Isn't it unusual for a heart patient to cry out like that?" Again, she hesitated. When she spoke, she appeared to be choosing her words carefully. It is not usually the case, but sometimes things like that happen. Probably he, had a very sudden severe pain. Most patients would just rumple over, but he managed to scream. It was unusual. She smiled, rather mechanically, I thought. But don't you think about it. You are getting along fine. You read one of your good books and don't think about it. Of course, I did think about it. I thought about it all the rest of the day and into the evening, and they finally gave me an extra sleeping tablet to settle me down. A couple of days passed uneventfully, and then one afternoon, as I was reading again, with the door open, I experienced the unpleasant sensation that I was being watched closely, intensely. I looked up. There stood the shabby hospital barber in the doorway with his sleazy alpaca jacket and his scuffed black bag. As before, the heavy black eyebrows lifted in a wordless question. As on the previous occasion, I was angry because he had startled me. Damn the man, I thought. Can't he have the common courtesy to tap on the door even though it is open? I don't need a haircut, I told him forcefully. When I do, I'll have one of the nurses inform you. Still he hung in the doorway. His face looked bland, expressionless, like a mask. But the bright black eyes positively glinted with disappointment and something more than disappointment. I wasn't sure what it was. I might say resentment, but that seems too mild a word. It looked more like positive animosity. I felt the blood rising to my neck and face. Will you please leave? I flung at him. I may have imagined it, but I thought he bowed ever so slightly. A moment later, he was gone. Resolving to speak to the head nurse, I tried to settle back to my book. But it was some time before I could comprehend what I was reading. I had begun to relax and was even looking forward to dinner when my mood was shattered by another human cry emanating from a nearby room. It was not a high-pitched scream this time. It was a moan, a subdued wail, but there was terror and hopelessness in it. I froze, my heart thumping again. I heard a shout, then running feet. An emergency exit door at my end of the corridor opened, and I heard light but frantically running feet clattering down the fire escape. A minute later, they were followed by heavy, purposeful feet pounding down 3 or 4 steps at a time. I could not see too clearly into the corridor, and in addition, the room from which the cry had come this time was further up. But as before, I heard people rushing along, exclamations, commands, murmured conversation, and then silence. In my mind's eye, I visualized the stretcher rolling down that dim corridor, once again with its silent rider beneath a gray, rubberized sheet. My Swedish nurse's aide was off that day. A new aide, a rather attractive little redhead, brought in my dinner. It was obvious that her cheerfulness was forced. "Who was it this time?" I asked. She was silent a moment, pretending to arrange my tray.
"It was Mr. Mayerton, room 375.
My room was 377. Mayerton's was just 2 rooms away. I tried to extract more information from the new aide, but I was unsuccessful. She told me she hadn't been present, that she had heard of Mr. Mayerton's demise only a few minutes before, when she first came on duty. The next day, I tried to pry more information from the other nurses. I had no luck. Either they had been instructed not to talk, or they had so decided themselves. They assured me that Mayerton had died peacefully. They professed ignorance of the moan or wail which I described. They told me that Mayerton had rung for help just before lapsing into unconsciousness. If there was a cry, they insisted it was involuntary. They shrugged off my question about running feet on the fire escape. I was probably drowsing, one of them said, and imagined the sounds. I tried to forget the episode, but I was far from satisfied. That afternoon, as I was reading mail, I heard a smart rap on the door. I looked up. A neat young man with glossy hair and a toothbrush mustache stood in the doorway. He was wearing a spotless white jacket, and he carried a small beige case.
"Haircut, sir?"
I hesitated. "Well, not right now. In a day or 2, perhaps." He nodded affably.
"Just as you say, sir. I'll check back in a few days."
As soon as he left, I was sorry that I hadn't told him to go ahead and cut my hair. In the first place, I needed a haircut. Beyond that, I wanted to question him about the other hospital barber. I hoped his shabby predecessor had left for good. The other barber, I told myself, had conditioned me to give a negative response. Smiling ruefully to myself, I went back to my mail. My recovery proceeded rapidly. Before the new barber made the rounds on my floor again, I was assisted into a wheelchair one afternoon and rolled down to the solarium to sit for an hour. While I was sitting there, looking rather bored, I suppose, one of the hospital security guards strolled along. I hailed him, and he walked over for a chat. In my somewhat unsystematic career, I have held a number of different jobs. Some years before, for instance, I myself had worked as a part-time security guard. Very shortly, therefore, the hospital guard and I were engaged in friendly and animated conversation. Inevitably, the conversation veered to the 2 recent deaths in coronary corridor. I noticed at once that my new friend became less loquacious. He looked around uneasily a number of times to see if anyone was listening. He appeared to ponder a decision. Finally, he shrugged.
If you promise not to say a single word to anybody, especially anybody here, I'll tell you a little story.
I swore on my honor not to breathe a syllable. He frowned, not sure how to begin.
Well, there was something mighty peculiar about those deaths. First of all, both those patients were found dead with a look of fear frozen on their faces, eyes still open and staring, as if they'd seen something so awful they died of fright. And both times, right after they yelled or groaned, a little guy carrying a black bag was seen running down that corridor. In fact, the second time I saw him myself, I chased him.
I felt my heart thumping. Can you describe him?
I saw him from the back mostly. Small, wiry character, wearing a thin gray jacket, carried a crummy little black bag. I just caught a side glimpse of his face. Looked smooth, not much expression, a poker face. Thick, black eyebrows.
That's the other hospital barber, I told him. He stared at me.
The other barber? There's only one, a young guy with a toothbrush mustache. Wears a white jacket. He's been here over a year.
He hesitated.
Hey, did you see this guy too?
I waved a hand. Never mind that now. Go on. He scrubbed his chin.
Well, I didn't see this creep the first time, but the second time, I was right there on the floor. Right after Mayerton groaned and rang for the nurse, I saw this wiry guy run out of his room. I started after him down the corridor. He bolted out the emergency door and down the fire escape.
Catch him? He shook his head.
Not a chance. He ran like a rabbit and he went over that parking lot fence like a deer. It took me 2 or 3 minutes to climb over. By then, he was nowhere in sight.
He looked at me.
But the craziest part is yet to come. You know that little black bag he carried?
I nodded.
Well, when he hopped over the fence, the bag caught on the top strand of wire and fell back in the parking lot. I picked it up later, and what do you suppose I found inside?
I have no idea, I told him. Don't keep me in suspense.
Dirt,
he answered.
Just plain dirt. Earth dirt.
As I pondered this, he went on.
And that's not all. Listen to this. When they ran in after Caldress and Meriton died, you know what they found sprinkled on both their beds? Earth dirt.
At this point, a nurse came to return me to my room. The guard bid me a hasty goodbye, promising to look in on me later. I didn't sleep well that night. The Swedish girl scolded me because my pressure had gone up. The night nurse said I had a temperature. But the final denouement was yet to come. I was sitting in the solarium a few days later, feeling quite chipper. The young barber had just given me an expert haircut when the security guard came along. He sat down, looking around warily.
I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I might as well finish the story.
Please do, I urged him.
Well, I had to turn in that little black bag full of earth. But before the police got it, I filled a paper sack with some of the dirt. I gave it to a friend of mine who works in a laboratory. He's got a microscope and all kinds of testing stuff. You know what he found out?
I can't imagine. He leaned closer.
That dirt. That earth dirt. He swears it must have come out of a cemetery.
I felt my heart thumping again, but I pretended that I was skeptical.
Oh, how could he tell that? From little bits of things that he found mixed in the dirt. Tiny chips of marble and granite, like from gravestones. Bits of artificial flowers and wreaths. And not only that, he says there were even a couple of little bone splinters that check out as human. And all the dirt was mixed with moss and mold as if it had been dug out of a wet, dark corner of the cemetery.
That's the story, and I can offer no explanation. The wiry little man with the masked-like face, the glittering eyes, and the heavy black eyebrows was never seen again. A certain friend of mine, who considers himself quite a clever fellow, says the explanation is obvious. The man with the black bag, he tells me, was a typical psychopath who was either born with a terribly disfigured face or acquired one in some horrible accident. Wearing a mask, he slipped into the coronary unit and literally frightened the two patients to death by merely entering their rooms and whipping off his mask. My friend says that the sprinkling of cemetery earth on the beds was only a macabre whim generated by a twisted mind. This explanation may sound plausible, but I myself feel certain that for some obscure psychic reason, the frightful creature whom I mistook for the hospital barber was powerless to enter a patient's room unless bidden to do so. I believe that both heart patients who cried out and died gave him permission to come into their rooms. No one, of course, seemed to remember whether or not they needed haircuts. I cannot explain my conviction. It remains with me. That is all. I will add only this. I am quite positive in my own mind that if I had given that lethal intruder assent to enter my room, you would not be reading this story, because I am sure that I would not have lived to write it. Thank you for listening.
Have a great night.